So I have a confession to make. I am a certifiable control freak. Amen. I hope that was healing for you, Gail. It's healing for me to get it out there. I heard a great joke about teenagers, but it's really way too off color for you this morning. So we'll just leave it at the control freak thing. If you're next to a control freak, don't nudge them. Just hang with me. I have a lot of trouble. Trying to get over the fact that people don't do things the way that they're supposed to do them. Right? And sometimes I spend exorbitant amounts of time trying to argue my point. And then usually the next step is the anger, right? Anger and frustration. And then finally, after the guilt trip comes the silent treatment. So I don't know if you connect with me on the control freak thing, you probably have your own formula of how you manipulate the environment that you live in. I'm not proud of it. I recognize it about myself, and I still don't quite know what to do with it because I still get really super frustrated when people that I live with in particular don't do the things that I think they should do. They need their own support group or a foundation that pays for their therapy as they get older. But this morning's text, I think, starts off with a question from a control freak. Maybe not, maybe just. But the question is really a challenging one. It's one of those like ultimate questions that you might ask or that you might try and avoid asking because you might be afraid of the conversation that might ensue. But here we go. So there was this lawyer or scribe or educated person who knew theology really well. And one day he was in a group with Jesus, and he asked, and the scriptures tell us like the crowd around him kind of coaxed him into doing it. But he asked Jesus this question: what do I need to do to gain eternal life? Now, I know what you're thinking. At the last party I had at my house, that was the main topic. Right? You just don't ask those kind of questions at parties. That is like worse than talking politics. But it's really such an astoundingly difficult and important question to ask. And the lawyer wanted to know, I need to know what the steps are to get to this place that I want to go, because life does not end when we expire here. We have eternity in front of us. And when I leave this life, I want to make sure that I'm in the happy place for the rest of eternity, as opposed to the not so happy place that is mentioned in Scripture by many times and by Jesus himself as fire in the pit. So it's a good question. He's trying to control his destiny by asking Jesus, what do I need to do? And Jesus kind of spins it around and says, okay, well, you're a priest or a scholar. What does the law say? What does the Bible say? And it's funny because if he was like really orthodox, he would have had a little thing around his wrist with the writing of what it actually was inside. So, Jesus, like, what does it say? He says, love God with all your heart, with all your strength, with all your mind, with all your soul. With all that you are, love God. And love your neighbor as yourself. And Jesus says, correct. And this guy wasn't happy or wanted to show off or something. He could have just said, okay, well, that's good. But he goes to Jesus and says, okay, well, who is my neighbor? Who's your neighbor? So Jesus launches into this parable about who we're to love. And it's so famous that I'm sure you've heard of it. We have an idiom, right? The Good Samaritan. We have a Good Samaritan law. It's almost like we have to help people around us because it's like the moral code. Regardless of what you think of them or why they ended up in that situation or your racial bias or your gender bias or whatever. You need to put all of that aside to help your fellow human in their time of need. So the parable goes like this. Maybe you know it. Jesus is telling them that there was this traveler who went from Jericho to Jerusalem. And he went on this road, and it's a treacherous road, and it's like a 4,000-foot elevation drop. I think it's like actually 3,600 feet. And it's narrow and windy, and there were robbers all the time on this road. Some scholars I was reading were saying that even up through the 1900s, if you were to travel on this road, you were still paying protection money to people because it was dangerous. So you typically didn't travel on this road as an individual. You travel in packs, right? Protection, or you would have paid someone ahead of time to make sure that your passageway was safe. But there was this guy, and he was traveling on the road all by himself, and he's traveling, and robbers came upon him. Go figure, right? And they stripped him of his clothes, took everything he had, and nearly killed him and left him in the ditch on the side of the road. I've never been to Israel. I have only been to Pennsylvania and seen the ditches on the side of the road. But I can imagine. So a priest comes by. Priest is coming down the road. He's by himself, but he's a priest. He probably paid money or had safe passage somehow, and he's traveling. And he sees this guy in the ditch, and he could have had a number of things going through his head, like, is this person dead or alive? And they're bloody, so if I touch them, I'll be unclean, ceremonial unclean, and I'm going to Jerusalem, and so he passes by on the other side. And then a Levite, another religious guy, lower down on the chain a little, comes down the road. And he sees him in the side, and he who knows what he was thinking. Maybe this was a decoy, because of the dangerous road, and robbers would lay down and pretend they were like possum, right? They'd lay down, and then if you came over, the others would jump out and get you. Like, who knows what he was thinking? But he didn't stop. Maybe his agenda was too full, and he needed to get somewhere. He went around on the other side, and the Samaritan, right? But we get lost in the Samaritan thing sometimes because we don't understand exactly what that means and why it's significant. We get the priest walks around on the other side. That's bad. And we get the Levite walks around. And both of these, the surprise in the story that Jesus was telling was both of these guys should have stopped, but they didn't. And Jesus was in the midst of Levites and priests. But the Samaritan comes by, and the Samaritan was kind of like the half-breed. The term was derogatory. A Samaritan was someone who was Jewish and then married out of the Jewish race, and therefore polluted the Jewish line, and they were the children of God, and how could you marry outside? So there was all this animosity, and the Samaritans didn't like the Jews, and the Jews didn't like the Samaritans, and a lot of the stuff in the Bible talks about that tension, because a Jew wouldn't even get Samaritan dirt on his feet, but Jesus goes into Samaria, all that stuff. So anyway, not to get flung from the story, but the Samaritan comes by, and the most unlikely person to stop, and he stops and he picks up the guy, and he takes care of his wounds with oil and wine, and then puts him on his donkey and takes him back to a hotel, motel, and inn. Pays the innkeeper for a couple of days, says, "I'll be back. Anything he needs, I'll take care of it. Don't worry about it." The innkeeper's like, "Okay." And then Jesus says, "So out of those three, who was the neighbor to the man in the ditch?" And of course, anybody listening to the story, right? You know the answer, right? The Samaritan ones. But that was so offensive to them. How dare Jesus tell that story? And he says, because he had mercy on him. Jesus says, go and do likewise. Love your neighbor. So this morning I want to share a real practical piece with you about loving your neighbor, right? If we look at this story to see how Jesus was telling us to love our neighbors, how would he tell us to love? He would tell us to pay attention. Pay attention to the people around you. See if they're hurting. See if they're bleeding. What are the ills of our society? We live in Jackson. I can walk down the street, not worry about getting jumped. If I'm walking down, Bennett's Mills, I might have to worry about somebody hitting me in a car. But, we don't have to worry about. But what are the ills, right? Heroin addiction, or addiction just in general. Literally illness, right? Cancer. Something that we don't talk about, I think, at least for me, take it for what it's worth, because I already confess I'm a control freak. Like, some of our relationships with people around us, even people we live with, are so bad because we don't know how to fix them. Like, it's so tough. And you and I, are we being the priest or the Levite, or are we binding up the wounds and trying to help one another fix those relationships, fix those physical wounds, fix the addictive stuff? That's what we're called to do. But it doesn't even just stop there, right? It's not like he didn't bind him up, pat him on the butt, and go, see you later, I'm going. He really cared for him. Like, what does that look like for us? How does it look? And we live in a society like I've wrestled with addictions my whole life. And I know that sometimes interventions are necessary. And it doesn't look like love in the moment. It looks like it's brutal. But it's necessary. It's a loving act that's so hard to do, because you're like almost withholding love, or at least that's what it looks like. to help the person. So it gets really hard sometimes, especially, like I said, with the relationships, especially with the relationships. I'm not a doctor, but, I'm sure if a doctor is in the house, like, the human body is so complex. When you're really hurting and they don't quite know what's wrong, or maybe they do, it's really a complex situation to heal someone. If you've ever had money problems, it's so hard to get out of that pit. So I know it's really complex, and I think that's why Jesus kind of was sharing this at the level that he did. It wasn't just, here's some oil and some antiseptic and a bandage and see you later. It was like, no, I'm going to make sure that you're okay beyond this moment. I'm going to take you, I'm going to put you someplace where you can rest and be safe and heal. And then I'm going to come back and make sure that you're still okay. That's what we're called. That's one of the ways we're called to love. Love like the Good Samaritan. But I want to take you back, and I want to bring you, as we close out, I want to bring you back to why this story was told. It's so rich in sharing with us that we need to put our biases aside, that we need to stop what we're doing and put our agendas aside and care for people and love like the Samaritan. But the story came about because the scholar said, love God with all you are and love your neighbor as yourself. And he asked the question about the second part. Well, who's my neighbor? He didn't ask who's God. One of the, I want to aside for just a moment, just a quick moment, and I might really just convolute everything, but I'm going to do it. One of the questions that gets asked of Christians all the time is, how could a loving God send people to hell? Have you heard that? Maybe you wonder that. I mean, it's a valid question, really valid question. And I think at some level that's where, if you grew up in Sunday school with a Sunday school background and your kind of theological education stopped at that point, that's a tough question. I'm married to my wife Denise. I love her. She, I got her to say the for better or worse lines before she knew too much. So she's locked in, but she made a choice. She made a choice. And I love living with her. I live under the same roof with her. I know her. I think I know her better than anybody else in the world. She's an amazing person. Life always isn't perfect because, I have the way that things should be in mind, and she has to deal with that all the time. But here's the thing. I made a choice to live with her, and I made a choice to get to know her. And the more I get to know her, the more I love her. I love her so much more now than I did when we first got married. And I loved her so much then. But I don't know if I'd want to live with somebody else. Here's the thing. Why would you want to live with a God for all eternity if you don't want to have the relationship with God, or you don't know who God is? I don't think God chooses to send us to hell. I think that we make the choice by our relationship, by choosing to get to know God. Like God, I want to keep knowing you because I want to live with you forever. Like, it's a choice. Do you follow? Okay, so that totally got off topic. Anyway, Um, anyway, here's the thing. I think the love your neighbor part isn't something we do as much as it's something that flows out of loving God with all that we are. Because if we don't love God with all that we are, I can tell you in my own life, when I'm out of sync with God, the real control freak comes out, and I'm not pleasant. The closer I am to God, the more easily I remember how much I'm loved by God, how much I'm forgiven by God, and I'm reminded to be humble. And when my love stops, like I have like this, it's not a glass ceiling of love, it's like a real ceiling of love. I can only love so much for so long. Like I shared with some of you, at my house, I tell my kids after 8:30, that's the ceiling of love right there. 8:30 at night, don't have deep conversations with me because it just gets messy. But God's love doesn't stop anywhere. It just keeps flowing. And the closer I am to God and the more connected I am with God, the more I love God with all that I am, the more that love, God's unending love, just flows through me. So if my kids ever get smart, and you can tell them this, they'll get a kick out of it maybe. Tell them, after 8:30, Dad, you just need to pray a little more. You need to connect with God. And then we can talk to you till midnight. Our love flows out of us to our neighbors the way that the Samaritan loved the Jewish person that got mugged on the road because of our love to God, with God. And if you've never made that conscious choice to love God or to get to know God, today's your day. And if it's been a while since you've like you're 8:30, you know, you need to just recommit or get back into like a rhythm with God because everything's not where it should be. We're going to pray in a moment, and that's your chance. Draw the line in the sand and start now. God loved you so much that he sent Jesus here to die for you so that you would know that to the depths that God would go to secure your life for all eternity in the best place you could ever imagine. And he sent the Holy Spirit to indwell you so that when your love runs out, when you're hurting, whatever it is, the Spirit prays for you, the Spirit rises up in you. Nothing can conquer you. Nothing can steal you from God's love.